Okay, I want to welcome everybody to the class, The Spanish Flu and the Coronavirus, a cross-disciplinary comparison. And I want to start off explaining a little bit why I call it a cross-disciplinary comparison. When I say cross-disciplinary, I'm mostly talking about the social sciences. So, we're certainly going to look at it, take a historical approach, this kind of overarching social science approach through history. But within those are certainly other approaches. There's an anthropological approach, as we discussed, the kind of culture and what the cultural barriers would be to telling an entire society that they have to stay in place, that they're locked in their homes. There's certainly sociological concerns as we talk about the racial effects of this, how this affects the poor versus the rich, and certainly, issues of privilege in there. There's psychological effects of this as well that we can compare and learn from as to how pandemics spread in the mind as well as in the body, how people panic and go out and buy tons of toilet paper, for example. There's criminological aspects, there's political aspects, certainly. There are constitutional issues in what are the powers of the executive and the legislature here in telling people to stay inside, in creating stimulus packages, the politics that go into that. So there's all kinds of different social scientific ways that we can look at this virus and how it spread. And the Spanish flu kind of gives us an example of this, kind of a laboratory where this is in some ways happened before. Now, it's not exactly the same, obviously, but there are some ways that this can be very comparative and helpful to us in understanding not only what's going on currently with the coronavirus, but what does the future hold after the coronavirus as we discuss and debate these things. And so tonight's our first session on this, and I apologize, last night was supposed to be, I ran into some technical issues, which I'll try to clear up. But what I want to do right now is I want to kind of go through a brief history of the Spanish flu to kind of give us a foundation and a framework as we move on. And I'll probably spend this week kind of talking about the history of the Spanish flu, might even show a documentary on it. And then moving on from there, we'll get into kind of the modern history of what's happened with the coronavirus. How was it first discovered? How was it spread? And you can kind of see where I'm going to go as we talk about what's happening with the Spanish flu here. So let me continue with our history of the Spanish flu. America in 1918 had been involved in World War I for almost a year. Now, this involvement wasn't very big yet because we were ratcheting up our troop. We were in the process of drafting, and we were in the process of recruitment to build up our troop levels to then send them over to Europe. And certainly the trials of the American force in Europe held the nation's attention at that moment. By November of that year, though, 3.7 million American men would find their way to the fields of strife. And unfortunately, all those men would also bring something pretty deadly with it. Many of these men would begin that journey with training at a small camp in an innocuous fort built to protect settlers and travelers on the Santa Fe Trail in 1852. And this fort was located in Kansas, and its name was Fort Riley. Fort Riley is located approximately 11 miles outside of Manhattan, Kansas. If you go to or are familiar with Kansas State University, then you kind of know where that is. It's on a dry and dusty plain, and at the time in question, it housed a training facility named Camp Funston. Camp Funston was the home of 26,000 fresh doughboys to be in the middle of their training, getting ready to be shipped out to Europe. Now, these young men from all over the 48 states of the time were none too fond of the horribly cold winters in Kansas, where the wind would just whip across that prairie, nothing to stop it, or the stifling hot summers where the dusty prairie just sat there and the sun baked it. And certainly peppered in between those were the blowing dust storms of the Kansas prairies. Yet, those circumstances were still pretty mild compared to the trenches of the battlefield in Europe. And even worse than the trenches of the battlefield in Europe was the worse hell that was about to come. On a Monday morning, March 11th, 1918, a young private and cook named Albert Glitchell reported the sick call with aching muscles, a burning throat, and a very high fever. A lot of young men on a Monday morning would report to sick call with the hopes of a reprieve from work, particularly the drudgery of serving up bread and coffee to thousands of people coming through. But the medic on duty who saw Private Glitchell realized as he took a temperature of 103 degrees of the young private, this wasn't a ploy just to get out of work. As Private Glitchell lay sweating through chills and aches and pains racking his body, he was ordered to a medical tent reserved for soldiers with potentially contagious conditions. Yet there was no escaping the fact that they had quarantined him now. He had spent the whole morning serving thousands of soldiers their food. And Private Glitchell had been serving meals to several hundreds of soldiers. A few hours after the cook had been admitted, Corporal Lee Drake presented with similar symptoms. And then Sergeant Adolph Hervey. And then within the next week, over 500 soldiers followed with similar complaints, blue faces, horrible coughs. By the end of March, the number would be over 1,000, and in the end, 46 of those 1,000 at Fort Riley would be dead. Major General Leonard Wood, the commander of the camp, stated in his report that while unusual, it was a factor of war, as thousands of young men were forced to live together in cramped conditions, and was nothing more than an outbreak of pneumonia attributable to the conditions of Fort Riley, according to General Wood. In the week of the beginning of the outbreak, the fort had been enveloped by a vicious dust storm. This is what he means by the conditions of Fort Riley. And in addition, the soldiers had been breathing in the noxious black smoke that had been caused by the burning of the thousands of horses and mules' manure, animals essential to the war effort at that time. But the only way to clean them was to burn all that stuff. And so this noxious black smoke, I imagine it's got to smell horrible, is just enveloping the camp. And though not mentioned in General Wood's report, and more likely the cause, as we've learned as we understand flus better, was the thousands of swine and poultry living in near proximity, not just to each other, but to the men as well. Avian flu viruses, which is kind of the origins of flu epidemiologically, they can easily mutate and make their way to pigs who are highly susceptible to it. And then the pigs, it can mutate in the pigs and transfer across to humans who then are very highly susceptible to it. So just as Camp Funston was recovering, thousands of its coughing Denzians were sent to Europe to fight in the war, to live in even more cramped quarters, which if you've ever studied anything about World War I, the trenches are hand-dug ditches. You literally, within the ground, are digging out rooms to sleep in, offices, things like that. When it rains, they fill with water. The rats are everywhere in them. These are not ideal conditions to live in by any means, and certainly they're breeding grounds for disease as a result. So they brought the flu with them there, where it spread first to France, then to England, Germany, and then Spain. Now, Spain was unique in this instance because Spain was not a participant in the world war that was gripping Europe at the time. And as a result, their press was much more free to report things. Whereas in the United States, in the rest of Europe, their press was censored very heavily for security reasons. You know, you don't want the enemy to find out what's going on in your camps or anything like that, use it to their advantage. So therefore, the reports of flu breaking out amongst the Spanish population much more widely reported, and people erroneously assumed then this flu must have started in Spain, and that's how it got its name, the Spanish flu. Of course, in Spain, they referred to it as the French flu because that's where they thought they had gotten it from. But to the rest of the world, and America in particular, the flood of news reaching them, how Spain was set upon by this illness, and including even its king, Alfonso XIII, led to its unfortunate misnomer, the Spanish flu. The flu had followed the movements of the troops and even the shipping and trading routes throughout the world. And by the end of the pandemic, only one major region on Earth would have been left untouched, and that was an isolated island on the Amazon River known as Marajo. Now, not only would it find its way from America to the far reaches of the Earth, but it would find its way back home as well in an even more virulent form. The virus had mutated by September 1918 before it reappeared in Boston. Now, there were several military camps around the city where men who were preparing to depart. Boston was the major shipping port to send the troops to Europe. So you have thousands of men from camps all over the United States now in Boston waiting to board a ship to go to Europe. And as the ships came back from Europe after emptying their cargo, they brought this mutated form of the virus back with them, and it quickly spread. Matter of fact, men began dying in the hundreds in Boston. Those that survived carried the new virulent form of the disease back to Europe with them, And they suffered another wave of deaths there that by the time it was over, the deaths from the Spanish flu felled more soldiers on both sides of the war than casualties from the actual war itself. The crowded and unsanitary conditions of the damp trenches and the compromised immune systems of the average soldier in war provided an ideal breeding ground for the deadly flu. And domestically, civilians fared no better. In August, a deadly second wave of the Spanish pandemic ensued. And this is probably caused by a mutated strain of the virus, which was carried from the port city of Plymouth in southwestern England by ships bound for Freetown in Sierra Leone, Africa, and Boston in the United States. From Boston and Freetown and from Brest in France, it followed the movements of the armies. The second wave lasted almost 6 weeks, spreading from North America to Central America and South America, from Freetown to West Africa and South Africa in September, and reaching the Horn of Africa in November. By the end of September, the flu had spread to almost all Europe, including Poland and Russia. From Russia, the epidemic spread throughout northern Asia, arriving in India in September, and then flared up again in China. In New York, the epidemic was declared to be over on the 5th of November, while in Europe it persisted amidst food and fuel shortages caused by the war. Most cases of illness and death due to the pandemic occurred during this second wave, but it wasn't over. Deadly clusters of symptoms were recorded, including nasal hemorrhage, pneumonia, encephalitis, temperatures of up to 104 degrees, nephritis-like blood-streaked urine, and even coma. So while the new virus struck military personnel and it influenced the war strategy, it did not spare those who lived in privileged conditions. And we already talked about one of the most famous cases in this regard being the King of Spain, Alfonso XIII, whose country wasn't even involved in the war. And so he was certainly not afflicted by the privations of the war, but he still wasn't privileged enough to disassociate from the effects of the disease. So by December 1918, much of the world was once again flu-free. And in early 1919, Australia lifted its quarantine measures. However, in the austral summer, and you got to remember in Australia, austral summer is what we would normally consider winter here in the United States, of 1918 and 1919, more than 12,000 Australians were hit by the third wave of the disease. In the last week of January 1919, the third wave reached New York, and Paris was hit during the time of the peace negotiations in 1919 to end World War I. Overall, fewer people were affected by the disease during the final influenza wave. Nevertheless, mortality rates are believed to have been just as high during the second wave. In May 1919, this third pandemic was declared finished in the Northern Hemisphere. In Japan, however, the third epidemic broke out at the end of 1919 and ended in 1920. So worldwide, we could say early 1920 is about when the pandemic finished. It emptied itself out. In total, it infected an estimated 500 million people worldwide, about 1/3 of the planet's population, and killed an estimated 20 million to 50 million victims, including some 675,000 Americans. At the time, there were no effective drugs or vaccines to treat this killer flu strain. Citizens were ordered to wear masks. Schools, theaters, businesses were shuttered, and bodies piled up in makeshift morgues before the virus ended its deadly global march. Some of this should sound, apart from the bodies being piled up, at least in the United States, should sound somewhat familiar. Hence why I wanted to kind of explore this kind of cross-categorical or disciplinary approach here and compare these two things. So that is the path of the disease that can be verified by the historical record. In other words, we have written records, we can track that disease in this way. However, there are some conspiracy theories regarding the beginning of this disease that have some limited evidence that I feel like we should explore because of the sociological and anthropological and political contexts of this. So not necessarily a historical understanding, but an understanding in those fields. So there are other conspiracy theories regarding the path of the disease, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on these as they are merely mere theories, and we have no concrete evidence to back them up. But as people start talking about how this is going, the coronavirus, and they're pointing and saying China, well, they're also are going to refer to the 1918 epidemic and point to China as well, according to these theories. And so I think we have to have kind of an understanding of these theories. And I'm not saying in any way that these theories are either true or false. What I'm saying is we don't have enough historical evidence to back them up. The story I just told is the one with the most historical evidence. So for decades, scientists have debated where in the world the pandemic, the Spanish flu of 1918, started. And they variously pinpoint its origins in France and the trenches of World War I, which would make sense given the conditions there that people would be very open and susceptible to disease. They pointed to Fort Riley, the story I just told you. They've pointed to places beyond, but the main theory I want to focus on is the one that says China was the origin. So without a clear location, scientists have lacked a complete picture of the conditions that bred the disease and factors that might lead to similar outbreaks of the disease in the future. Of course, what we're going through right now is not an influenza epidemic, so it's not quite the same as the Spanish flu, except that it is also a major pandemic that's influencing the world. Now, in 2018, a breakthrough find of Inuit Eskimos who had suffered and died from the disease and were then buried in the permafrost of the Arctic Circle, we rediscovered, and they were able to revive the virus from frozen samples of the deceased tissue. I don't know if that's a great idea to be reviving viruses, but it was the only way we could get DNA samples from it in order to test it and see where the disease originated. Now, of course, the problem with this is you've got a limited population of people living in this area. They might have been the first people to get it. They might not have been the first people to get it. And so it's still kind of hard to trace the geographic origin of it, but at least we can understand the viral permutations and how it got from one thing to the other. And no surprise, they broke it down and studied its DNA to discover it was indeed once a virus that affected swine and was inherited from them by an avian strain like most flus are. But again, we were not able to identify its geographic origins and thus end the debate and the theories. The only evidence currently supporting the Chinese origin hypothesis is presented by historian Mark Humphreys, as quoted in a 2014 National Geographic article on the origins of the pandemic. His research is placing the flu's emergence in a forgotten episode of World War I. The shipment of Chinese laborers across Canada in sealed train cars to then transport to Europe to work behind the lines in the Allied war effort. He says that newly unearthed records confirm that one of the side stories of the war, the transportation of these 96,000 Chinese laborers to work behind the British and French lines on World War I's Western Front, may have been the source of the pandemic. In other words, it originated in China, and these laborers brought it across North America with them and then transmitted it to Europe. So even as the pandemic's origins have remained a mystery, the Chinese laborers have previously been suggested as a source of the disease. Historian Christopher Langford has shown that China suffered a lower mortality rate from the Spanish flu when it was at its peak during the second wave worldwide, which kind of suggests that the Chinese may have already developed some immunity to it, which means they may have already suffered it, which means that the origins may have actually been in China if they were the first ones to get it there. So it suggests some immunity was at large in the population because of earlier exposure to the virus. Humphreys has found archival evidence that a respiratory illness that struck northern China in November 1917 was identified a year later by Chinese health officials as identical to the Spanish flu. He also found medical records indicating that more than 3,000 of the 25,000 Chinese Labor Corps workers who were transported across Canada en route to Europe starting in 1917 ended up in medical quarantine, many with flu-like symptoms. Physicians began debating the origins of the pandemic almost as soon as it appeared, and Higgins said that historians were soon joining them. France's wartime trenches, ridden with filth, disease, and death, were originally seen as the flu's breeding ground. Matter of fact, when I was young and I first heard about the Spanish 1918 flu, that's exactly what I was told, is that it started in the trenches, these poor health conditions. So the flu's tendency to strike young adults was explained as the disease targeting itself to young soldiers in the trenches. And the theory also purported to explain how the illness spread from Europe to the cities such as Boston and Philadelphia by pointing a finger at returning troops and ships. But in his study, Humphreys reports that an outbreak of respiratory infections, which at the time were dubbed an endemic winter sickness by local health officials, were causing dozens of deaths a day in villages along China's Great Wall. The illness spread 300 miles in 6 weeks' time in late 1917. Now, obviously, this is a lot earlier than the epidemic's, historically traced origins in Fort Riley in Kansas. Now, at first thought to be pneumonic plague, the disease killed at a far lower rate than is typical for that disease. Humphreys discovered that a British legation official in China wrote that the disease was actually, a flu in a 1918 report. And Humphreys made the findings in searches of Canadian and British historical archives of the wartime records of the Chinese Labor Corps and the British legation in Beijing. At the time of the outbreak, British and French officials were forming the Chinese Labor Corps. China wasn't technically involved in the war, though they were considered an ally. They were too far away from any front. A lot of China was a puppet state of Britain and France and Portugal at the time. And so what they saw them as is this great pool of labor who could come and dig trenches and do all kinds of jobs so that European men could be used on the front line of the war. And so there were heavy recruitment efforts in China promising them a great deal of pay to come over. Now, this is normal in historical times. It's how a lot of Irish came to America during the Civil War, is the need for manpower. And so they go there and they recruit all these Chinese. The idea, though, is to free up soldiers to head to the front at a time when they were desperate for manpower. Shipping the laborers, you could have got them in China and then gone around the Horn of Africa, which actually from the Chinese side is pretty dangerous. From the European side, it's super dangerous, but it's even more dangerous from the Chinese side. There's a good chance going around the Horn of Africa, the way the cross currents are, that you wreck a ship. And it takes a great deal of time. There's lots of wonky weather there and things like that. So it was too time consuming to bring them around the Horn of Africa. It tied up too much shipping as well, which they were using for Allied war materials, particularly from United States to Europe. So British officials turned to shipping the laborers to Vancouver on the Canadian West Coast, kind of a short trip from China to Vancouver, actually, and then sending them by train to Halifax on the East Coast, from which they could board ships that could go to Europe. And these ships were already had troops and food supplies and things like that. So it was really didn't mess with their shipping schedules. So desperate was the need for labor that on March 2nd, 1918, a ship loaded with 1,899 Chinese Labor Corps men left the Chinese port of Huawei, and I think I'm pronouncing that right. I apologize if you're Chinese American and are looking at this, if I'm not. But they left for Vancouver despite them being identified with plague-like symptoms, and the same symptoms which had stopped the recruitment of workers in that region as well. So in reaction to anti-Chinese feelings rife in Western Canada at the time, the trains that carried the workers from Vancouver were sealed. The Chinese labor workers on these train cars were not allowed to get off. Food and water put through slots in the doors to them, and they stayed on there, and they handed out their pots of human waste, basically. Special railway service guards watched the laborers, who were kept in camps surrounded by armed guards. Newspapers were banned from reporting on the event, and roughly 3,000 of the workers ended up in medical quarantine. Their illnesses often blamed on their lazy natures by Canadian doctors who had very stereotypical racist views of the Chinese. Doctors treated sore throats with castor oil and then sent the Chinese back to their camps. The Chinese laborers then arrived in southern England by January 1918 and were sent to France, where the Chinese hospital at Noyelles-sur-Mer recorded hundreds of their deaths from respiratory illness, an undefined respiratory illness, just respiratory illness. Historians have suggested that the Spanish influenza mutated and became most deadly in spring 1918, about the same time that they had arrived there, spreading from Europe to ports as far as Boston and Freetown, Sierra Leone. And by the height of the global pandemic that autumn, however, no more such cases were reported among the Chinese laborers in Europe. Now, what it would take to finally track the geographic origins of the pandemic would be kind of this broad, nuanced tracking from flu victims before and after it that might finally narrow it down. And essentially, scientists would need a genetically identified sample of the influenza's H1N1 virus taken from a victim who died before the first widespread outbreak of the pandemic in spring 1918 to point to a time and place as the likely origin of the pandemic, and one from China in 1917 would certainly fill the bill. However, we have never found that sample or that case. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's just, we were lucky to find a sample of the virus that we could replicate only because it was buried in the permafrost in Alaska. Most geographic climes and everything are certainly going to deteriorate the body and the virus itself without a viable host to feed off of. And so it's going to be very difficult to find that. Dr. Tauberner, who you'll see some on the news today, actually, who was an infectious diseases expert with the CDC, said, "I'm not sure if this question can ever fully be answered," and he's referring to the geographic origins of the 1918 Spanish epidemic. And matter of fact, he said in comparison that even the origin of a smaller flu pandemic in 2009 still eludes certainty. And that was only, 11 years ago, and we still don't know where the origins of it were. And he's talking about SARS in that instance. Ultimately, these kinds of historical analyses cannot definitively reveal the origins and patterns of spread of emerging pathogens, especially at the early stages of the outbreak, Tarnberger said of the new historical report. In the end, however, knowing the origin of the disease might provide information that could help stop a future pandemic, making the search worthwhile. I would say that the takeaway message of all of this is to keep your eye on China as a source of future diseases, Higgins says. And he points to concerns about avian flu and the SARS virus, both arising from Asia in the last decade. History has a way of repeating, he says, and research into the origins of the 1918 flu could help prevent a scourge like that from happening again. And you should be aware, he's writing this in a National Geographic article in 2014, long before any of this was proposed. And so it does, for a lot of people, this will be convincing enough evidence that, okay, this originated in China, the Spanish flu originated in China, what's wrong with the Chinese? And how much world pressure politically will then be brought to bear on the Chinese government? How much resistance then will the Chinese government, Chinese people have to this? And, there's always the possibility, does this lead to some kind of not maybe, a Cold War, if not a hot war, or economic retaliation? And how does this interfere with the, the global economy of the world that certainly is heavily influenced in logistic chains by people in China? And so these are the kind of interesting questions that this history is going to bring up as we compare and look at. Certainly there are repercussions in China as a result of this after the war, which we'll get into as we move on and get more comparison. But today was really just kind of this broad-based historical thing of the Spanish flu, and I'll focus more tomorrow on the history in the United States, particularly how did the government and society respond to this, and give a broad-based history of this. And then what I hope is in the next week, we can get into a comparison with the coronavirus in terms of the history. And we'll break it down a little bit more succinctly and talk about, the sociological, the anthropological, the geographical, the economical, the political aspects of this, and kind of give a very broad-based social science approach to this. So that's all I had today as far as the presentation. And what I want to do right now is open it up to any questions from you guys regarding this. So let me stop sharing this and bring, how are you guys today? Let me unmute you all first. Okay, there we go. How are you guys today?
Good.
Pretty good.
Oh, pretty good, yeah.
Did you guys have any questions regarding what we kind of went over today?
I don't think so.
Okay, well, let me
China is making it hard for us. They're killing us.
Who's killing us?
China likes to kill us. That's what I
Wow.
Again, are we right to blame China for this?
No.
I mean, we really have no way of knowing what the geographical origin is. And in truth, the whole Spanish flu thing, Spain's still pretty upset that we call it the Spanish flu when they say, look, it started in America. Why aren't we calling it the American flu? Why does Donald Trump get to go out there and say, why are you calling it the China flu? Because it started in China. Do we know that for certain? I mean, I'm asking. We'll get into that as we go on. But
the China flu.
Is China a source of pandemics constantly? Are they a constant worry? And if so, why? Is it because of the population, the billions of people? Is it because of their governmental system? Remember, they weren't communist in 1918. They were actually very monarchical. They were ruled by an emperor, although they were kind of split a lot. But so these are all questions that bring up, what does the future look like for us after this pandemic when we look at what happened with the Spanish flu in 1918? So what are your thoughts on this? What do you think this demonstrated here, this brief history?
Well, I don't know. To me, I feel like it's weird because we're talking about this now, and then this seems like it's going to be something that, like, we're living through the history that people are going to, like, talk about now, because, like, this is affected a lot, I guess. So it's weird to think about.
What's really fascinating when we get into the psychology of this and kind of the psychological aspects is that after 1920, nobody remembers the Spanish flu. How often had you heard about the Spanish flu before this whole coronavirus pandemic?
I never heard about it until you talked about it, like, on Sunday. I didn't know what it was.
Yeah, and so what you get is here's this huge worldwide pandemic. It was a disease that killed more people in Europe than since the Black Plague, and yet nobody knows about it. We kind of have a collective cultural amnesia about it. Why do you think that might be? And do you think that's something that once the
Everybody's
quarantine
dead.
is over and we go back to school and we start living our lives, is this just going to be a footnote in history that didn't really last? Or is it truly going to be something that defines your generation?
I feel like it's like a big thing for us, but for others, it's not.
Something you just, like, tell your kids, you're like, yeah, I remember when I didn't have a junior year, like, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But how often do we hear in history
I didn't graduate
about the generation who were young men in 1918? The generation would have been some of the older soldiers in World War II, for example. Do you think it was just the time and the place, the wars, or do you think there was just like a need to, let's just forget this because it was a horrible time, there was nothing we could do? And does that speak to how we'll treat it in the future going forward? Will we have to have a war to forget it, or will it just become a footnote on its own as something, God, that was just a horrible time, and there's no point in dwelling on it?
And there could be a reason why we don't learn it. Like, we don't know that much about it, but other countries could know about it, and we don't talk about it because there's something that they don't want us to know about it. Like, if that makes sense.
Who's they?
The government.
Oh.
So you think it's the government not to talk about it? That, okay, the government said, okay, we're not going to discuss this.
I don't know.
This is a real conspiracy.
It's the true conspiracy.
You know what's ironic is in D-Day, World War I. How many pictures have you seen of people celebrating in the streets for victory in World War I? I've seen a few, but guess what the people are wearing?
Yeah.
Masks. They're all wearing surgical masks because they're fear. And I mean, these are pictures you just don't see. And it begs the question, why did we forget it? Again, World War II? Was it the excitement of World War I? Was it the big economic boom of the 1920s, the roaring 20s? And again, you have to ask the question, were the roaring 20s in part a reaction to things are getting back to normal? How badly did the Spanish flu affect the economy at the time? Certainly there are differences. We're not in a world war right now, for example, but there are things we might be able to pull out and say, okay, well, these are different, these are not. So if you guys don't have any other questions, then what I'm going to do is end this meeting, and I'll get it posted up on Facebook tomorrow and open up discussion on there for people who might be watching the video. And I certainly encourage you people to get in there and comment, to ask your questions, and we'll build on this. And hopefully we can meet again tomorrow night. It might have a little bit of an issue tomorrow night because tonight actually is my fourth son's birthday, and we're skipping making a meal because I'm trying not to go to the store that much. So I'm going to the store tomorrow, maybe get a cake, and we'll celebrate tomorrow night. So I'll try to make sure we have time for this. Otherwise, I will catch up on the weekend on this and get us back to a 5-day, or 5-lesson structure. Okay. All right. Well, it's nice seeing you guys. If you need anything, feel free to let me know, and we'll hopefully see you at another class later.
Okay. Tell him happy birthday.
All right. We'll do.
Yeah.
I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.
See ya.